I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds and welcome to my horror house. Although this week we're going to stray a little way off the horror reservation. I revisited recently a film that was very dear to me back in my youth and I found that I still adored it. So just wanted to gabble about it with you guys for the next 10 or 15 minutes if that's okay. It's, as you'll know from the thumbnail, from 1994. It's The Crow. How 90s is this movie? Extremely 90s. And I'm a 90s kind of guy, so I want to try and bring you as objective a view of this movie as possible. So if you'll permit me, I'm going to remove my nostalgia goggles. They ain't coming off. I freaking love The Crow. Yes, the poster was on my wall in my student digs in the 90s. Yes, the soundtrack is killer. Yes, this is the one goth, grunge, alt-90s zeitgeist movie to rule them all. I'm sorry, singles, but I'm with the film that got Stone Temple Pilots the MTV Movie Award for Best Song. The film is based on a comic by James O'Barr and it concerns, well, it's probably easier to just repeat the voiceover from the start of the movie. People once believed that when someone dies, a crow carries their soul to the land of the dead. But sometimes something so bad happens that a terrible sadness is carried with it and the soul can't rest. Then sometimes, just sometimes, the crow can bring that soul back to put the wrong things right. A year after their deaths, Eric Draven is resurrected to take revenge on those who murdered him and his fiancée, Shelley Webster. Caught up in the collision between Draven and the gang of murderous criminals who like to set fires and watch the city burn on Devil's Night, the night before Halloween, is Police Sergeant Albrecht, who couldn't bring the gang to justice, and Sarah, the young girl who befriended Eric and Shelley in life and is probably the only one to mourn them in death. Returning to a 25-year-old film in 2019 now, I wondered whether we would have to address the tired old story structure of wife or girlfriend being killed so that man can seek revenge. Now I know Eric is killed as well, but he's the one that's supernaturally brought back to go on his revenge journey. I think we can give The Crow a pass, if only for the true life inspiration for the original comic book. I'm going to read a little bit from Wikipedia. Yeah, I know. O'Barr, a troubled young man with a childhood spent being shuttled between orphanages and foster parents, was enjoying one of the few happy periods in his life. For 3 years he'd been going out with a girl he'd met when he was 16 years old. By the late 70s they were engaged. 2 weeks before her 18th birthday she was run down and killed by a drunk driver. The result was Eric Draven. Says O'Barr, "It just poured out. My character is able to return from the grave because some things just cannot be forgiven." And rewatching The Crow, it's not so much a revenge fantasy. I mean, for a start, this comes from a real place, a personal place. It's a howl of rage against an unfeeling universe rather than a revenge fulfillment fantasy. And it's also so much more than cool guy goes round killing a bunch of people in cool ways. I mean, it is that. That's kind of why I loved it in the 90s. One of the many reasons I loved it in the 90s. Coming back to it in 2019, I think there's more to it, and I think that's why it's endured. And I genuinely do believe The Crow has endured. Something happened at the turn of the millennium, the year 2000, and my ability to reckon on the passing of time just absolutely went on the fritz. I don't think the first decade of the 21st century happened. 1994 doesn't seem that long ago to me. So it's really strange to stick it on many years after I'd last seen it, and to see the cityscape realised in models and miniatures. We've just become so used to seeing all of this stuff done on a computer now. But and this might be the nostalgia goggles talking. I like the aesthetic of it. I like the look and feel of it. Your eyes can, right, you clearly know that you're looking at models. Your eye is not fooled in that way at all. But it's a set that it's there and it can be shot. Your eye is just fooled in a different way as it would have been if it were nowadays a CG landscape, because the computer, the in-computer camera would be doing so many tricks and moves that your eye would be able to tell that it was fake in just a different way. I love this little period of cinema that's a sort of bridging period. Jurassic Park is a prime example, a bridging period from the magic of the birth of cinema, the practical, your Jack Pierce makeup. I mean, Stan Winston is an amazing example of this. A bridge from the old way of doing things, of building actual things, and computer-generated stuff. There's computer-generated stuff in The Crow out of absolute necessity. Some of the opening shots of the city do look a little bit like FMV cutscenes on an old PlayStation game. It's, I guess, intended to evoke the similar kind of imagery as the opening of Blade Runner, but with much less money. Okay, a computer's plopped some flames here and it's plopped some flames there, and I kind of dig it. To me, it sort of adds to the heightened reality, comic booky kind of vibe of the movie, and the camera just physically goes swooping in amongst these buildings, acting as the supernatural creature that the movie is named after. We, for the moment, are the Crow flying through this city where this fable is going to play out, this fable of revenge. I'm no historian of comic book movies, but it sort of seems to my mind, in my limited understanding of comic book movie history, that before this sort of 90s wave, comic book and superhero movies sort of stood like monoliths. You had Superman, you had Batman, and this current crop, this current tsunami of superhero movies, I think owes more to the early to mid 90s, the late 90s, the sort of second wave of comic book movies, the likes of The Crow, Blade, I guess stuff like Spawn and things like that as well. And everyone at the time was trying to make their cinematic language marry the comic book origins of the stories that they were trying to tell, which seems really quite quaint now that Marvel are saying, well, no, we're just making movies. I mean, you could argue, I love the Marvel movies. They are a little homogenized, but they don't look comic booky. I mean, in the 60s, your Adam West Batmans had the pam, wow, wham sound effects on the screen round about the time period of The Crow, very loosely. Dick Tracy kept the 4-colour vibe. Ang Lee's insane Hulk movie literally had comic book panels on the screen. If you want me, by the way, to go further off the horror reservation and talk at some point about Ang Lee's Hulk, boy, would I love to talk about that movie. The Crow clearly, I think, takes a lot of its visual cues from clearly the comic book it was sourced from, but cinematically speaking, Tim Burton's Batman. Personally, I think you can draw a straight line from Burton's Batman to Alex Proyas's The Crow, straight through to Rodriguez's Sin City in one scene. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into a chicken and egg of this. I know that Frank Miller published Sin City before the Crow film was made, and the Crow comic was published before the Sin City comic book was published. All I'm saying is, it was interesting for me to note that there's a scene in The Crow, the very first gang member that Eric gets his revenge on, Tintin's death scene, where the colour sort of completely drains out of the frame. It's practically at this point a black and white scene, except for the trash can fire, and the orange of the flame in the fire is very prevalent. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Visually, that's what Frank Miller was doing in Sin City, and Robert Rodriguez obviously mapped over onto his movie much later on. And while we're talking about cross-pollination, I think clearly Tim Burton's Batman begat The Crow, and lo, The Crow begat The Dark Knight and Christopher Nolan's Batman movies. It's impossible to watch The Crow now and not at points think of Heath Ledger's Joker. And I think the influence on Nolan's Batman films doesn't just begin and end with Joker. And by the way, I'm not saying that Heath Ledger was copying anything that Brandon Lee brought to the table, and I'm not saying that Alex Proyas ripped off anything Burton did, or that Christopher Nolan ripped off anything that Alex Proyas did, but you can't, I think, watch The Crow now and not see this sort of Venn diagram of crossover and tessellation. So not just the Joker, although I think clearly Draven and especially Heath Ledger's Joker are cinematic cousins, but how about the walking up to a table full of bad guys scene in The Crow and The Dark Knight? And how about Draven's burning crow symbol on the ground against Batman's burning bat logo? I think it's on the side of a building in The Dark Knight Rises. Not copying, just lineage, and I think it's interesting to note, and I hope you think it's interesting too. Instead of tying myself up in knots, I think it would make sense to give the last word on this to Jack Nicholson's Joker.
I made you. You made me first.
When I say I made you, you gotta say you made me. And how childish can you get?
And if we're talking quotes, let's take a minute to acknowledge that so much of the dialogue in The Crow just zings. Greed is for amateurs, disorder, chaos, anarchy. Now that's fun. Incidentally, how Heath Ledger's Joker is that line. It seems our friend T-Bird won't be joining us this evening on account of a slight case of death. You know that Lake Erie actually caught on fire once from all the crap floating around in it? I wish I could have seen that. A whole jolly club with jolly pirate nicknames. He was already dead. He died a year ago, the moment he touched her. They're all dead. They just don't know it yet. What the fuck you all pin it up for, crackhead, huh? Halloween ain't till mañana. Oh, great, great. Guy shows up looking like a mine from hell and you lose him right out in the open. At least he didn't do that walking against the wind shit. I hate that. And on that note, let's hear it for Ernie Hudson. I know he is going to forever be remembered as a Ghostbuster. I don't think Ghostbusters ever let him, if you'll pardon the pun, bust out and do everything that he could do. One of my favourite Ernie Hudson performances is in the TV miniseries Wild Palms, hugely underrated TV series. And I also really like him in The Crow. I think he gets to bring to the table a lot of different colours, a lot of different things than he was able to in Ghostbusters, and even notably, I think he's allowed to be more funny in The Crow than he's allowed to in Ghostbusters. In fact, while we're talking about the wider cast, David Patrick Kelly as T-Bird is absolutely phenomenal. I know you, but you can't be you. We killed you. There ain't no coming back from that. There ain't no coming back from that. Phenomenal bad guy that you really just want to punch, and the way he goes out is phenomenal. I mean, Tony Todd's in this movie. Tony freaking Todd. And the cast are so good that he doesn't dominate. Now, I'm not saying that Tony Todd's a scene stealer. What I'm saying is he is so freaking charismatic. He is so magnetic that usually when he's in a movie, your eye is drawn to him. Now, your eye is drawn to him in the scenes that he's in as they are supposed to be, but not to the detriment of anyone else. This is such a great cast full of such great characters that you can put Tony Todd in a supporting role and he supports rather than steals the show. You've got Bai Ling in a super creepy half-sister with top dollar incestuous sorceress role who covets the power of the crow, culminating in a fantastic sort of crow attack where her eyes get pecked out, damage to eyes by a creature that could be straight out of the Lucio Fulci playbook, so you know I'm down with that. And so we come to it. We got to talk about Brandon Lee. This is Brandon Lee's movie, as great as the rest of the cast are, and they are great. This is Brandon Lee's movie from start to finish, and he is phenomenal in it, and I genuinely think this would have been a breakthrough movie for him and a breakthrough role for him had the on-set tragedy not occurred. I was mentioning computer technology earlier. This is the first film I remember, and you can correct me if I'm sort of historically wrong. I'm not claiming this was the first film, but the first film I can remember where certainly a principal or very important actor passed during filming, but technology was such that the film could be completed. Scenes that needed him or shots that needed his face on it could be inserted into the film. The next one I really remember was Oliver Reed dying during Gladiator. Now, Brandon Lee, if you don't know, I'm sure you do, was accidentally wounded on set during filming by well, if you want to find out about it, you can read up about it on the internet. It's thoroughly depressing. I'll be honest with you. Absolutely needless. All I will say is that anyone who complains these days about health and safety regulations in the light of this subject matter, you can jog on. Apparently, completely understandably, director Alex Proyas was seriously considering shelving the film after Brandon Lee's death. There is such a weird interplay of themes between what happened to Lee and what was going on in the story. A kind of strange confluence that grimly probably helped the film's success when it was initially released. But in truth, that weird confluence is what keeps The Crow dear to the hearts of us 90s kids who were there when the movie came out. Now, I don't want to sound all old man, you had to be there nonsense. You didn't. You can watch The Crow now, and if you dig it, you can dig it in exactly the same way. If you don't like it, that's fine. It's not for you. But at the time, this film was for us, man. This was for me, my generation, my kind of people. In this day and age of so-called millennials versus boomers, it's nice to stick on that flick and remind everyone that Gen X is still here, baby, and we were beautiful, we were darkly poetic, and we were nihilistic as fuck, man. Brandon Lee gave us a sensitive type of action hero. Lee's portrayal of Eric Draven is the Kurt Cobain of comic book superheroes. I'm glad the tragedy of his death didn't mean the abandonment of the final project that he was working on, his last work. Instead, it's given him a very strange and eerie kind of immortality that seems fitting. Watching back in my 40s, man, The Crow is a hell of a lot sadder than I remember it being in my callow youth. I mean, in my 20s, yeah, I turned up for the fucking Doc Martens and the big black overcoat and the makeup and the fucking bird and the supernatural shit. I turned up for my God, that soundtrack, The Cure, Stone Temple Pilots, Violent Femmes, the Jesus and Mary Chain, Pantera, 9 Inch Nails, the Rollins Band, Rage Against the Machine. I turned up for that. Now in 2019, in my 40s, what I go back to is a fantastically visual, gorgeous, right in the bullseye of the wheelhouse of my sensibilities, tone poem meditation on grief, loss, revenge, all whilst looking and sounding fucking cool. I think next week we're gonna keep the bird theme, but like Marty McFly, we're gonna go back in time.